Good morning, APUSHers. Purpose of this video is to take a look at topic 7.13, World War II in the military. Specifically here, we're going to focus on the development of the war, the course of the war in the European and the Pacific theaters, going from early part of 1942, really going through about the middle part to late part of 1944. We won't get all the way to the end of the war here. Small disclaimer here, this is a very brief overview of the course of this fight, trying to point out the highlights of what you need to know for testing purposes. I will probably struggle to keep this brief and to not go off on very many tangents, but the goal that I have in this video is to keep things fairly brief and concise and try to keep my focus. So let's go. So on the College Board side of talking about these topics, they really do want to make sure that you are aware of the major trends and the major strategies that are in place. STAR testing purposes does get a little bit more specific. For the most part, the information I am relaying to you is specific to what it is going to be covered within these tests. So here we go. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese control in the Pacific was strong. The attack on December 7th did not just include Pearl Harbor. It included, sites going into British Malaysia, to Wake Island, down into the Solomon Islands here in the south. And for the next 6 months, there's really virtually no success for the United States military in any of this. So much so that by the time you get to the spring of 1942, in the Philippines, the American forces that were there, remember the Philippines are an American colony at this point. This is U.S. territory. They are defeated and captured and forced to surrender, and the prisoners there are, forced to march through the jungle in what is referred to historically as the Bataan Death March. This type of brutality is going to lead to some of the reinforcement of the idea that the American side of the war is the moralistic side of this against these types of wartime atrocities. The extent of Japanese control through the war is really strong all the way through almost down to the Australian coast. And it looks like there is not a real, clear picture of what's going to happen to change this. And then the turning point here happens in June of 1942 at the Battle of Midway. What happens at the Battle of Midway is that American code breakers, they intercept the Japanese attack plans and are able to interpret it. And so when the Battle of Midway occurs, the Americans know that the attack is coming. And even knowing the attack is coming, this is going to stretch for days across here, where it is by and large air-to-air combat, where the Japanese aircraft carriers and the American aircraft carriers never really come in sight of each other. But by the end of this, the Japanese have lost 4 aircraft carriers. And at this point, the turning point means that this extent of Japanese control is going to start contracting, and that contraction is going to continue steadily until the end of the war. But do not make the mistake of assuming that it's at this point there is a belief that the war is going to be concluded, because the next step in this is to actually kind of put this strategy in place. And that strategy is called island hopping. As you're looking at the Solomon Islands and the Gilbert and the Carolines and the Marshalls and the Marianas, the idea of island hopping is to not have a straight line progression of the fight. The idea is to identify strategic locations somewhere in the mix of this where it might be less heavily fortified, and to focus your fighting effort there. And once you can acquire one location, you can use that as an air base that you can use to launch attacks to other surrounding locations. And every step along the way, this is proven to be an extremely difficult proposition. The fight on this is going to kind of run in 2 fronts led by 2 men. There is Admiral Chester Nimitz, that's him here on the left. He is leading the island hopping campaign through the Marshall and the Mariana Islands in 1940, starting in late 1943, 1944, into the early part of 1945. If you have the opportunity to ever go to Central Texas, the Nimitz is from Fredericksburg, Texas, in what used to be the Nimitz Birthplace Museum is now the National World War II Museum for the Pacific War, just specifically on the Pacific War because that's where Nimitz was focused. Gentleman here on the right, that is General Douglas MacArthur, and he is leading the island hopping campaign through this western track, going from Guadalcanal, which is here in the Solomon Islands, through Tarawa, and then Nimitz going to Guam, and then to Saipan, which is on the northern track on this. My grandfather, when he enlisted in the Navy in the 1940s, he was stationed at Guam and was involved in some of the island hopping campaign here through the Marianas. This island hopping campaign, there's the Nimitz track and here's the MacArthur track. This island hopping campaign, what is notable on this is that it gets increasingly intense the closer things get to the home islands of Japan. But once you get to Guam and once you kind of get to areas around the Philippine Islands, you are getting to the point where you can begin to launch bombing missions into Japanese cities. Not talking about atomic bombs, we're talking about carpet bombing with conventional bombs that are going to kill hundreds of thousands of people in an effort to try to weaken the Japanese military efforts on this. And this is as you go further into the war, things get more and more brutal on this. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, highlighted in the yellow box there. These islands are, the island of Iwo Jima is smaller than the city of Pearland, and it's going to take over a month, almost a month of fighting to acquire this. In Okinawa, it's going to take a couple of months of fighting to accomplish this. And by the time that this is secured, two things that I need to make sure I am reminding you of here. That when by the time this is done in June of 1945, the war in Europe is already over. I'm focused on the war in the Pacific because it is easier to process this if we focus on the Pacific theater first, but this is going on concurrently with the European course of the fight that's on the next slide. And the other thing to make sure that you are aware of is that at the conclusion of this Battle of Okinawa in June of 1945, the next step in the military strategy is to prepare for the invasion of Japan, which is scheduled to commence in November or December of 1945. The development and the use of atomic weapons to end this war in August, nobody knows about this in June of 1945, simply put, because the plans and the program to develop the bomb is so secretive in nature. And in June of 1945, the bomb doesn't exist. There's been no successful completion of that project. And so at this point, all plans lead to an invasion of Japan scheduled to happen before the end of the year. At the same time as the military developments of the war in the Pacific, the European war is going strong. Kind of awkwardly, we start with the turning point of the European War. The turning point battle of the European theater is the Battle of Stalingrad. And this is happening before there really is any kind of American involvement anywhere in Europe. This is purely a fight between the Nazis and the Soviets. The Battle of Stalingrad lasts for months, and by the peak of winter in January of 1943, Nazi supply lines have been frozen, and their military uh, units that are established there are frozen out and isolated. And this turning point is just like the Battle of Midway. There is no prospect the war is going to end anytime soon. But you can look at this after the fact and you can see that everything prior to Stalingrad is an effort where the Nazi army is expanding outward across the map. And then after Stalingrad, it is a steady progression of Nazi occupation, well, contracting across the map. American involvement in this is going to begin in North Africa, going through the invasion of Italy. I'm going to try to fix my dates on this, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, hopefully it means I have fixed it. But this starts in November of 1942 and runs through the summer, July of 1943. American forces entering in Morocco and kind of going across North Africa, across the Kasserine Pass, and advancing up to Sicily into the boot of Italy. By the time American forces move into Italy, Mussolini is exceedingly unpopular among the Italian people because their viewpoint now is that Mussolini has brought this war to them. And so the bulk of the fighting that takes place in Italy, all of this fighting is really against the Nazi army, against the German soldiers that have been stationed there. For leadership on the American war in Europe, in in North Africa going into Italy, there's really two generals that are leading this movement. And that is General George Patton and General Omar Bradley. These two men are really kind of seen as being among the heroes of the entire war, because it is this prospect and this movement that is the first time that you get, well, this kind of success against any of the Nazi force coming from anything on the Western Front. But it's not really the Western Front, right? It's kind of, ironic that the first effort that the United States makes in the European theater of war is not even in Europe, it is in North Africa. When the United States does begin fighting on European soil and kind of launching an invasion into the Western Front, it is with the invasion of Normandy. This is the D-Day invasion led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the largest amphibious assault going from water onto land in the history of mankind. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers involved with this. There's going to be more soldiers are going to die on D-Day than on any other single day of the war. This is a huge development, and ultimately is going to prove to be successful. June 6th is the D-Day invasion. By the time you get to August 1944, Allied forces have recaptured Paris. And by the time you get to the end of 1944, Allied forces are ready to push into Germany. The last ditch German effort, their last counteroffensive on this, is known as the Battle of the Bulge. It's kind of labeled on the map, but the labeling is just kind of like off track here. It is like taking place here, like right on this edge of the border between Germany and Belgium. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because the Nazis focus all of their efforts into one location, because they feel like if they can break through the Allied defenses here, they can make it over to the coast and get to a negotiating place where there could be negotiations to end the war. Well, instead, the Battle of Bulge is going to be a defeat for the Nazis, and starting in January of 1945, the Allied forces are going to be pushing into Nazi Germany and ultimately push towards the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany at the end of the war, about 6 months later. This is a brief overview of the fighting on both sides of this. The battles that I am pointing out and the men that I am pointing out as the leaders on this, they're important for you to kind of keep track of, both as examples to bring into short answer questions, as well as maybe expecting to see their names show up in test questions that you might see on this. So I'm sorry for the brevity of some of this. Also sorry to kind of bring it back around to testing and test questions, but I think that's kind of where the logical place takes us on this. In 713C, we will talk about the last phase of the war, which is going to be on the ultimate Allied victory, but also on the horrific revelations that the Allies are going to discover at the end of the war.